So I think the one limitation to this is accepting that people may feel that this is reductive. And that's something I really want us to be very cautious about. And that's why I started off saying, what do all of these tools have in common is that they sit within a context. So that context must be explained, that we are saying we are just looking at what are the things that we think would make the most difference to your performance given what our organization is working on now. And there's just some data.
Welcome to Leadership Rewired. Allison Allen and Dean Martin invite you to join them for an honest conversation that brings a personal perspective to the issues of leadership.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Rewired podcast. I'm Dean Martin, and I'm joined with my co-host, Allison Allen. And for those who are just listening, you'll be reassured to know that we have yet again color coordinated our outfits without even meaning to. Just, Allison, great to have you here. And to those that are listening, we're really excited to welcome you to the first of a 3-part series. So this series is called Leading Minds, Harnessing the Power of the Brain for Exceptional Leadership. And today we'll be exploring leadership self-assessments. And in our second episode, we'll talk about ADHD, what that means for leaders, what that might mean for you as a professional, if this is something you have been diagnosed with, or if you suspect that might be going on for you. And then thirdly, we'll look at what does the leader's brain do under stress. So those are 3 parts. But in particular today, the leadership in the mirror, unlocking growth through self-assessments and 360-degree feedback. So, hi, Allison, and why in particular, why this first one do you think is worth our time and attention?
Yeah, I think over the last couple of years, organizations have been just figuring out how to win the war for talent. I think they've been absolutely focused on, retaining the best people, but lots of layoffs of really great people.
Yeah.
It's been sort of all over the place. And sort of a lot of the data and the trends are telling us that organizations are moving into 2025 really focused on skills. So you're going to hear things like skills-based hiring. Let's hire people for not just a current role, but future roles. And I think leaders in particular need to be able to be agile and know themselves really, really well, to know what they're really, really good at and not so great at. And one place to start, which is why I love that we're starting with this 3-part series around assessments, is really getting a thoughtful assessment of where you are.
Right.
So that's your leadership skills, how you show up, how you influence people, how you drive business.
Yeah.
Whether you are already a leader or an aspiring one, taking advantage of this aspect of your career is super important right now. Change is not going to stop. It's going to be something that's reoccurring. And again, your ability to shift, that agility that you need to have in your team in order to build high-performing teams is really centered on your own skills and knowing yourself really, really well. So whether you're building your own path or supporting your team, having a self-assessment, it's just a powerful tool that's going to be in your toolbox, and it should be something that you have readily available to yourself.
Yeah, super. And what you'll also hear us talking about today is leadership development self-assessments. We might call them, just go the shorthand, self-assessment. We might call them leadership development tools, or 360-degree, meaning all the way around. And another way of talking about that is multi-rater feedback. So whatever you and I are talking about here, Allison, pretty much talking about the same thing, some kind of an online assessment that's usually done tippity-tappity typing, answering some questions, maybe sending it out to some other people in your team, your manager, your clients, whoever, getting a report back, and it says stuff with charts and graphs and lines and suggestions, etc. So that's just like the quick and dirty. That's what we're talking about. Some kind of a self-assessment or a leadership assessment or a multi-rater, but it's all kind of one and the same, where we're talking about something that's where we want to highlight the difference. We'll make sure we're doing that. But if you hear us using different terms, it's all kind of like the same thing. And that's why it's in our first part here, really looking at yourself in the mirror, leadership in the mirror. And as you said there, Alison, this is really important for leaders to seek whatever methods they can to get a more accurate assessment or sort of feedback on how they are showing up, so they can develop and grow in a more intentional way. So that's what we really want to talk about. So organizations, this is typically something that an organization would deploy, wouldn't you say, Alison? Mm-hmm. It's like...
Yeah, I mean, most organizations, again, we started off talking, organizations are moving toward hiring for skills. If you're going to lead and you want to know how great you are at it. Yep. So there are resources, again, as Dean mentioned, that we can point you to, but most organizations, especially as they're building their sort of leadership cohort, they will actually do leadership assessments to identify leaders' gaps.
Right.
And that's not for punishment or performance management. It's really for, where are our leaders today? Where do we need them to be in the future? What are the gaps? And then what do we need to do about it? Whether that be developing a program or creating a training course or getting you an executive coach.
Yeah.
Whatever the case may be, think of it like, especially if your organization comes to you, think of it as a fitness test. Basically to see where you are, where we need you to be, what the gap is, and a plan to work on it.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And with any kind of fitness test, it's also it's relevant to what do we actually need this person to be able to do. So that's, is this fitness for basketball or sprinting? So within a leadership context, what's your fitness here? Are we talking about leadership at our most senior level, or is this leadership for aspiring leaders? What does the organization really need to be developing? So I think that's our second piece that I really see, in addition to what you've said, Alison. Like organizations will look to see where are their gaps, how fit, or, what's the capability within our leadership population. And then also, and especially so, what do we need our leaders to be able to be doing, given where our organization is now and where we are going? What is the bigger context there? So we want to be able to be quite transparent with our leaders and not just give a bland message of be a good leader. But in our organization, according to our mission or our values or how we are growing or downsizing or advancing, these are the things that really matter to us. Collaboration might matter, or maybe it's strategic thinking, or with us, it's all about empathy, or in this organization, it's about agility, whatever it is, to be able to use a tool like this that then gives a common language to leadership. And then it's not just this be better and try harder and let's develop people. It gives another sort of a double click into, when we're talking about leadership now, we're talking about to what extent are you, empathetic in your leadership? To what extent are you now being transparent in your communication? We know that's important. So it's giving that shared language, really. Are the other?
Yeah, I just would, just to add something there, because I just want to be clear that the listeners understand. I think if an organization is coming to you and saying, hey, take a leadership assessment, what you also want to understand in that question is, what are the competencies they're looking for now? Like, what are the skills that they're looking for now? And where do they want you to be? So that you can really, truly understand, not just because of the assessment telling you X, Y, Z, you can truly understand what's sort of future forward. And I remember in a time when we would plan out leadership development over 3 to 5 years.
Yes.
The world has absolutely shifted from that. And so I think organizations are really just trying to stay on top of this and make sure that as they turn and as things move or shut down a market and open up a market, that they have leaders in place who can match what's needed in an organization. So that's just another way of sort of saying what Dean also said. So I just wanted to just get that color.
So matching that, yes, for sure. And I think also in terms of the the matching, it gives leaders greater clarity around what is expected of them then.
Yeah.
Whatever those competencies are. We'll talk about competencies in a minute as well. But Alison, are there other spaces or other areas of an organization where something like an assessment is used? I'm thinking like talent acquisition or in, I don't know, succession planning, that kind of thing.
No, those are both great examples. I think when you are thinking about, again, future forward leaders for those organizations that actually do succession planning. I mean, succession planning is one of those things that people are either doing or not doing. But for those that do, I do think they think about the folks that they have in the pipeline and how do we keep their leadership skills moving forward and matching again where the organization is today. So that is a place where you actually see it. And there are, for certain level of leadership roles in organizations, TA folks will actually use a form of a leadership assessment to make sure that, you know, the person coming in is meeting a bare minimum requirement around leadership expectations.
Right.
People who do both of those things, succession planning and talent acquisition assessments, are usually thinking about culture. Because they're really concerned about how do we sustain the culture in the future of succession planning, and how do we make sure that anybody who comes in fits into the culture that we're trying to drive within the organization. So if you're asked to do it in either of those situations, think about it from the context of continuing to build the culture we want to see that has deemed the organization most successful.
Right. And with culture, can you just say a little bit more about that? So would that be as explicit as an organization saying, for example, in our culture, we really value collaborative working. You're not successful unless you're with a team. Would that be an example of how an assessment is used?
Well, I mean, culture, as we know, it's what is it? It's the behaviors, the policies. It's how you experience the organization. The things that make the organization tick.
Right.
So behavior, policies, practices, experiences.
Right.
So if you are an organization that values collaboration or transparency, or an organization that's all about risk taking or getting shit done, all of those things, by the way, can all coexist in the same culture.
Yes.
If you are an organization that values those things, you want to make sure that you're developing your leaders to, one, do that, but also be able to get that from teams that they work with, as well as if someone new is coming in, you want to make sure that they don't disrupt that flow, because every moment, time, minute, hour, day, is built on being productive so that we can make money. And we don't want to bring in someone who's not going to, facilitate and make sure that happens.
Right.
So 100%.
Right. So the feedback from these sorts of assessments then would be viewed at an individual level. Like you've just said, we've just hired somebody and we've noticed, for example, on the dimension of collaboration, they're on the lower end. That now means we need to really make sure we're supporting them and we're being very clear around the way in which they might prefer to work. They might need a little bit more direction. And then secondly, at an aggregate level, so actually maybe running a leadership development program for middle leaders and saying, of our 300 middle leaders, oh, great, 80% of them are really high in collaboration. Good. We're getting it right. They are really holding firm what's important for us as an organization. Actually, we're seeing pockets here. Where are the pockets? Oh, the pockets are sitting in our sales group, or they're sitting within HR. What's that about? So they pieces of data, would you say, larger pieces of data for senior leaders to look at and say, what's the impact of these leaders on an aggregate on the culture of our organization where we're trying to improve collaboration, or this is about risk taking or whatever? Would you say that's also?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would sort of break it up is, if I'm doing one of these assessments for leadership development, it's about thinking about that person for a next role. So I want to make sure that they are building capabilities. If I'm doing a leadership assessment in the spirit of succession planning, I want to start to work with this leader to develop certain skill sets so that when we are ready for them to go into that role, there's not a beat that's missing, right? We are able to move forward. For recruitment and talent acquisition, it's a little bit different in the sense that, if we have somebody take an assessment and we hire them 100%, we turn that into a development plan so that we can make sure that we can support them with onboarding, integrating into the organization, navigating the organization in the most successful way. Right. If we decide not to hire someone, and usually that's not based on an assessment alone, by the way, but if we decide to not hire someone, we will, again, most organizations should be doing this as a practice, bake some of the feedback from the assessment into feedback to the candidate. So the candidate actually fully understands why they did not get the job, but aren't closed off for the future and should circle back around to the organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice. Good. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's look at just some of the assessment tools that people may have heard of or that you and I are fond of, examples of assessments, and then we can actually just talk about what they have in common or how they're different and what we need to be cautious of when deploying them.
Yeah, I have favorites, and one of my more recent favorites, even though I've done it before, is the Hogan assessment. Right. I've had Hogan's done on me personally and on my team, and just recently got certified in it. But Hogan itself measures personality traits as well as potential career derailers. And I know that word derailer just feels like, oh God, scary. And it's like, what does that mean? But you want to think about derailers as, personality traits is like, how does Allison show up? What are her perceived strengths and how those strengths might impact other people or might be overused. Yeah. And derailers are almost the same thing. They're still strengths, right? But they could be overused in crisis or overused when you're taxed. And the tool allows you to understand fully what they are, these attributes and traits, and when they're in good use, what it looks like and feels like, and when it's not used appropriately, what it looks like and what it feels like. So it's one of my favorites. It tells a real holistic story about you as a leader. Right. And so, I think it's a great tool for organizations to use.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Hogan too. I think also because of how it has been created is that it's really reliable in terms of predicting future behavior or typical behavior. Mm-hmm. And this is, and I'm jumping a little bit, but a little bit of a health warning in that some other leadership development assessments or 360s may not necessarily accurately predict future behavior. And that's not what we're trying to do necessarily. But the self-assessment would ask us questions around maybe our preferences in terms of thinking. That doesn't necessarily mean I will act in a certain way, but that I have a preference. So, but Hogan has got good reliability there. We've also got, I would say there's one called ESSKI, the Emotional Social Competency Inventory. This is based on the work of Daniel Goleman and emotional intelligence. So quite not necessarily a leadership development one, but when used with other more specific skills-based assessments, it can be combined with something to make quite a bespoke feedback tool for leaders in organizations. What the ESSKI measures is 4 things in particular: somebody's self-awareness. So what's the accurate awareness of their skills and their strengths, and do they know that? Can they understand that? It measures self-management. So to what extent can they manage their own distressing emotions, or, are they adaptable? The third thing is then their impact on others. So relationship management. So how do they demonstrate skills like conflict management or influencing skills? And then also the fourth area is that of social awareness. So such as the extent to which they have empathy or can read a room, that kind of thing. So The ESCI is quite a broad tool. It's still giving us very clear feedback on those specific behaviors or competencies in those 4 areas, but then that could be applied to, which of those competencies is most important perhaps for an aspiring leader, which one for a VP, which one for our sales team. So it's giving you, it can be used really broadly and then applied to a more specific setting within a population. That's why I like the ESCI. There are others, the Standout Strengths Assessment, that's from the Marcus Buckingham Company. There's DISC. I don't know, are you familiar with DISC, Alison?
I am familiar with DISC.
Yeah, I've heard of DISC. So that's also measuring people's behavior and preferences across 4 domains. The DISC standing for dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. There's Gallup's Strength Finder. There's Insights Discovery. We did that quite a lot at Bloomberg, didn't we? The Insights.
Yeah.
What did you think of Insights? How did we use that there?
I'm a fan of Insights and continue to be a fan of Insights. It still feels like when I think about like a Myers-Briggs or a Hogan, I still feel that Insights tends to bring the language to a very common place so that there's sort of like agreed understanding.
Right.
And I think the way that it's administered, whether it be individually or as a team or even in a 360 sort of format, again, it's using very consistent language that makes it easier for people to understand. So I continue to be a huge fan of Insight Discovery.
Yeah. And that was...
I think it must be said, by the way, that none of these are sponsoring this podcast. So we are not getting anything for this. We are just sharing with you what our preferences are.
Yeah. And would encourage you to, if you're unfamiliar with some of these, look them up and see what they sound like. And also we'll remind you again at the end of this, but if you are within an organization and you use some of these, please, use the hashtag Leadership Rewired, leave a comment for us at the bottom of this podcast. What are you using? What's working well? Some of these, we're really focusing on leadership development because of the nature of our podcast. But even something like Insights Discovery, that can be, or the Standout Strengths tool, that can be used broadly across an entire organization, leaders or not. That really brings about a beautiful opportunity for a shared language and almost taking some of the stigma out of, I like to do it this way and you like to do it that way, and rather, I have a preference for, I use fiery red when I'm working in a project, or Alison, you tend to think more blue, which might be analytical. So it has a lovely shared language there. What I would love to just talk about, and I know we weren't trying to do a teach on those tools by no means. We couldn't do that unless it was a 900-part series, which would make our eyeballs bleed. But I really want to look at what is common about these tools, so that whoever you are and whatever you have exposure to, let's just sort of come down to a shared understanding of what, in terms of looking in the mirror as a leader, what it's really doing when you have been given a tool like this or a multi-rater tool. The first thing I really want to talk about is we've sort of hit on competencies, but we started off today talking about skills here, Alison. But a competency is typically something that is measured within these tools.
Yeah.
You might hear that word being used. And a competency in this context is any skill, any piece of knowledge, or any attribute of a person that differentiates performance for a given role or job. And that's the key thing. So there are as many competencies as you can imagine there are, because there are thousands and thousands of ways in which we think, operate, our preferences, and how we interact with others. But most tools will first ground their their assessment in what is the specific job or task, or what is the context that we are creating a list of competencies for, and therefore we're going to measure people on these competencies. So everything in common will, everything that these assessments have in common will be some kind of espouse, this is the purpose of this tool. This is to give you a general sense of how to be more effective as a person in a workplace. Or this might be a tool specifically looking at your thinking preference. Or this might really be about what will differentiate your leadership within a tech environment. Every competency every tool might have a different context that says, okay, it's here for work. And then second point will be, therefore, what are the skills? What are the things we want you to know? Or what are the ways and what are the things you possess, attributes that we would see would make a difference? So that's why when people get a self-assessment and it's got 9 things on it, often they say, well, that's not everything that I do. And we say, sure, that isn't everything that you do. Those are the things that have been identified as being the most important things that will differentiate between you being kind of okay and exceptional as, insert context here, as a senior leader, as an aspiring leader, as somebody who works in collaborative environments, whatever that context is. And then we can see, okay, this is therefore why I'm being measured on these things like my empathy or my commercial focus or my entrepreneurial skills or my analytical thinking, because these are the things that will make a difference.
Yeah, just to add a point there, I think organizations that roll out self-assessments, like we talked about, and then they roll out team assessments, like we've spoken about, and then they use the sort of multi-rater feedback. Yeah. Hopefully they're doing it in a way where you are getting the context of every single time that assessment happens. Otherwise, it could feel, a multi-rater especially, can feel very affronting, and it can feel like, oh my God, all this feedback is coming in, especially if you've never heard it before. Yeah. So whoever's, in your organization who's rolling it out, you, again, need to understand the context.
Yes.
How will the assessment be used? Is it part of your development strategy? So that when you hear whatever you hear, right, you can take it in and really own it.
Yes.
And start to make some of those shifts that are really important for you to make in that organization. And I think the other thing I would just say to that is that when we, and I've been in organizations where multi-rater was used in the performance review process. And so that I would love to sort of separate as something completely different. It's obviously, if it's part of performance management, that is part of your development. And that's an exercise that should be integrated. Yeah. What we're talking about contextually here is sitting strictly in that space of development. How do I become a better leader? Here are some things that my colleagues, peers, direct manager had to say. How do I take that in for my future development? So I just wanted to give that additional color.
Well, let's build on that, Alison. I like that because there are many limitations to self-assessments and multi-rater, and there's some really good practice that we would want organizations to use in order for these not to be given a bad name and for it not to be damaging to some people in an organization. Right. So that's like one good example you've given us, is that if you're rolling this out, are your people really clear on how it's being used, and are they given the support they need in order to develop from it, rather than it being seen as something that's punitive? You only got 7 out of 10 for this and everyone else is 8 out of 10, and therefore this means something bad for you.
Yeah.
So setting the context. What are some of your own personal experiences you've had of these sorts of feedback tools, Alison? And what do you think are some of the limitations? I've got my own as well. But if people say, "Hey, I don't like this," what are they likely to be complaining about?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been on both sides. I've been on receiving them as part of my own career development within an organization. I think my introduction to these tools or these types of tools was when I was VP of Talent and Leadership at Deutsche Bank. And that's where I got introduced to like Insights. And even before that, I got introduced to Myers-Briggs. So I've always had positive experience. I've never had any experience where these tools were used to my detriment. They've always been set up in a way that I understood why it was being self-assessed and what the data was going to be used for. Right. I think, that's why I think that the implementation and the execution of this is people already feel judged 24/7 when they're in organizations. The last thing they want is another assessment and not understand why. So when I've seen it go sideways is when it's misaligned with the culture. Right. So, and that's usually where you'll have some learning and development function that's super excited about a tool and you never had a tool before. And all of a sudden we're rolling it out to all of the leaders and everybody's like, what is this thing? Right. Yeah. Or people feel that the questions that they're being asked aren't questions that they're typically asked. And yet we're asking them and assessing them on something that they never even knew was really important. So when it's misaligned with your culture, it's one of the biggest challenges with these tools. And it's really important that we, one, choose a tool that matches the culture that you're in, that gives you the data. And now we're talking to the L&D or the people professionals who are implementing these tools. You want to make sure you're choosing a tool that speaks to your culture, that serves your culture, and that will lift your culture up.
Yes.
And that when the leaders take that information in, that they understand it. So that's the change management piece of it and the communications piece. Yeah. And if you're truly not going to use it for performance issues, to really make sure that it's centered and positioned in a development fashion. So the biggest challenge has been misalignment to culture. What about you? Where do you work?
Well, I want to say that's really about being able to show the relevance to it, or the relevance of it. Hey, and there's the fancy word for that is face validity. When a leader receives a report and it's talking about leadership, at even first glance, would they be able to look through those lists of competencies or whatever and say, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Oh, I can see how this would probably drive good results in this organization. Or yes, this is in keeping with our financial services organization or our tech startup or whatever. Yeah, I like that. So the relevance has to be there. And, also done through a good change management, process and getting feedback from people and making sure that really that their concerns are heard, that they see this is really about your development. We really want, you're here already. You're a leader. We love you. You're important. Look at how this is just one other way in which we can give you greater insights and maybe some feedback from others that can focus your growth and your development in a clear way. So that you can really move forward rather than, I'm not sure, I just need to be better, but I'm not sure how. So it can be a really powerful, wonderful tool if positioned nicely. I would say, the complaints that people would have, and I think when I first did one about 150 years ago, I don't think it was set up in that way. So it felt very scary. And the first time I received one, I think I was probably 25. Even though I was still working on my self-awareness there, to get something of you written down on a piece of paper, with bar graphs and lines and charts and stuff, it can be hard to accept.
Yeah.
To go really seriously. So I think the one sort of response or limitation to this is accepting that people may feel that this is reductive. And that's something I really want us to be very cautious about. And that's why I started off saying, when I was saying, what do all of these tools have in common, is that they sit within a context. So that context must be explained, that we are saying we are just looking at what are the things that we think would make the most difference to your performance given what our organization is working on now. And there's just some data. It is not everything. It is not everything about your beautiful, amazing, complex personality. It does not predict your performance in the future. You're far more than that. You have much more agency over over your life than what these 5 bar graphs tell you. So to like calm people down around that and say, you're not just that, you're not just yellow and green, or you're not just your 2 top strengths in standout. There's a lot of richness and depth to you as a person. This is the context. Is there value given this specific context? And just kind of calm people down a little bit.
Yeah, I think we're mixing in the sort of, I go out, I ask for assessment, I want the feedback, I get with a coach, I understand.
Yeah.
And then there is the organization and their reasons, whether it be succession planning, leadership development, or recruitment, for asking you to complete a self-assessment, or even a 360. Either way, you want to understand the full context. Why? What's it meant? How will I learn from it? And how will I be supported in my future development? I think it's really super important to talk about that. And I just want to, I know we're getting like close to time, but the other thing I want to really just double click on is that these self-assessments, when implemented, can feel like someone's telling you about where you're weak and where you're not good. And I really do want to get people to think about themselves as whole. You have everything you need in order to do job, to push through anything you experience. And if you think about yourself as whole, then you're always thinking you have what you need. It just may need to be better, or it may need to be enhanced, or it needs to grow. Yeah. And so if you have a situation where people are using words like weakness, which can be very damning and can feel, not very comfortable, that's part of the execution and the change management, and really give the feedback that they should shy away from using words like that. How do we want to sort of talk a little bit about how to get started, or how to
how to get the best out of it? Yeah, for sure. So the first port of call, if you haven't received one of these already, would be to look and connect with your talent development team if you have one, or speak to your manager, see if there is something within your organization that is used. Or you could actually, Google stuff, look at what we're putting in our podcast show notes as well, around some recommendations of how you may, maybe ask your manager if there's an opportunity for that to be paid for by the organization, or you just do it yourself and say, hey, I've selected one. I care a lot about my leadership or my own growth. Here's one I would like to do myself, and then find a good coach. Reach out to Alison or myself. We are experts in being able to support the leaders and people in understanding whatever their survey or their feedback or their report might look like. Speak to your manager. Maybe there's somebody in the talent development team or the learning and development team who can say, I'll happily work with you on this. Maybe an HR business partner has that skill. So, embrace this opportunity to grow and say, let's see what I can learn from this. Find a tool that will help you to grow specifically within your context, rather than just a broad, how do I be better? But I'm really wanting to be promoted, or what do I think are the top skills that would really differentiate me given my position within the organization? Okay, this is the kind of tool that would really focus my attention. That's the one thing I would say. That's how you could get started. Alison, what would you add?
No, the only thing I would just to wrap this up, I think, the key takeaways here are: think of self-assessments as an opportunity for you to increase your self-awareness about where you are and what you can do and what you can focus on. Yeah. It is always good to not just have a self-assessment and then have you interpret the data. It's always a good idea to work with someone to interpret the data. So whether that be a coach or someone in your L&D function, reach out to one of us. Getting someone to help you work through what's being said in that report is super important. Yeah. Use the feedback. If you get something from a report, it's telling you X, Y, Z, you're resonating with it. Use it. Use it as an opportunity to develop. And then, build accountability for yourself. And if you're doing this with a team, build accountability with the team through clear expectations. And then just just think about anything that comes in that report as beneficial to you for your long-term success. I think that's really super important.
Yeah. That was so lovely that you mentioned, you said those things, Alison, because, our limitation for these assessments are also just gathering, are when people just take them out of interest and then do nothing with it.
Right.
It's just that's like measuring yourself on the scale every morning to see if you've gained weight or lost weight. Like, what's it going to do? You just keep on gathering data. What are you doing with it? So, and also let yourself have time in order to develop as well. Some of these assessments, even if you did them 6 months or a year ago, there's still validity in them to say, I'm still seeing a recurring pattern. Let me keep on working on this rather than I just need to do the assessment, quickly get an action plan, and then something is resolved. Incorporate this into your practice. That is actually what Leadership Rewired is about. That's why it takes time to rewire our thinking, whatever is being measured in this assessment. Get some good feedback on what this means and work with the coach and understand, what do I do differently now? How do I see the difference, the positive impact as a result of me changing my thinking or my behavior? That's a rewiring. That's a daily, weekly, monthly, annual kind of commitment to your own growth. So we are big advocates of something like a leadership development assessment. We believe you can grow without them. And also there's enormous value to having them. So please leave us a comment at the end of this podcast. Let us know if there's your thoughts on them, how they have helped you, or any health warnings around them, what you'd like to share. Use the Leadership Rewired hashtag. We'd love to continue to build our community here by hearing what others are using within organizations. Let us know how that goes. Reach out to Alison or myself if you'd like to work with us, if you want support in understanding your own, or want a recommendation on how to make sense of something that maybe your organization has given to you. Anything else from you, Alison? Yeah.
No, I think that was a good way of summarizing. So thanks for joining us today. We hope this conversation has given you some insights on how to think about your own leadership development, or your own leadership development within the context of an organization. And more specifically, how, if you haven't thought about it, you can start with some form of a self-assessment that could give you a foundation for which to start.
Yeah.
So again, reminder, just reach out to your learning folks, reach out to us. Check out some of our recommendations. And as always, we so appreciate you participating in our podcast and listening and being part of our community. Give us feedback, make suggestions on things you'd like to talk more about. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.